For 45 years, HBO was the gold standard for televising the sport of boxing. From Foreman, Frazier, and Ali to Tyson, Holyfield, De La Hoya, and Pacquiao, just to name a few, nearly all the biggest fighters and fights were on HBO. But as all championship reigns must come to an end, so did the reign of HBO boxing in December 2018. So what happened? How did a network powerhouse like HBO relinquish its stranglehold in the sport? And more importantly, why? Find out on this episode of Business Tales. On January 22, 1973, a young George Foreman stepped into the ring with Joe Frazier for a Sunshine Showdown in Kingston, Jamaica. History would be made not only when Foreman ended Frazier's long championship run with a TKO at 1:35 in round 2, but also when a new pioneer in television would forever change the way boxing was broadcast to home viewers. In prime time and commercial-free on the first ever premium pay cable network. At a time when the major broadcast networks had lost interest in the sport, HBO would quickly become the presenter of the majority of the most memorable fights in the sport. It quickly became clear that boxing would become a cornerstone piece of HBO's programming and would be responsible for a large portion of its early subscriber base. Mega events like Ali Foreman and Ali Frazier would help carry the new network through the 1970s and into the 80s. The network's presentation was something very different than what fans were used to seeing. By not having to cut away to commercials between rounds and between fights, viewers were able to learn more about the fighters and their corners. With cameras and microphones focusing in on the corners, fans now got to see a cut man in action and trainers managing their fighters' physical and mental state between rounds, adding more depth and allowing for a more complete story to be told in the ring. As important as it was to televise great fights, the network put an equal emphasis on the quality of production, both from a visual and audio standpoint. This would be the case until the day the program ceased to exist. Much time and effort would be spent hyping upcoming fights with backstories and interviews with the fighters, encouraging fans to become more invested in them and their careers. Throughout the decade, several exceptional voices from a young Marv Albert to then future International Boxing Hall of Famers Ray Leonard, Barry Tompkins, and Larry Merchant would provide commentary and analysis for the product, translating the action from the ring to our televisions at home through lines of coaxial cable. As production continued to improve, so did the volume of great fighters and amazing fights. Warriors like Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearns, and Julio Cesar Chavez would help usher in a new era of boxing as HBO's dominance in the sport continued to expand. The network wasn't void of any competition, however. Bob Arum, whose fighters appeared on HBO, also ran his promotion Top Rank on ESPN throughout the 80s, and premium cable rival Showtime would soon throw its hat into the ring, causing worry of fighters and promoters jumping ship, a concern that would eventually come true. Rounding out the 1980s came the rise of a fighter that would transcend the sport like never before, Iron Mike Tyson. Tyson, with his dominant knockout power, quickly became a household name, with his fights becoming a spectacle to anyone from the die-hard fight fan to the complete boxing illiterate. Tyson fights soon became can't-miss pay-per-view attractions that often ended before the viewer could even finish their first slice of pizza. Boxing was back, and Mike was the crown jewel. Eventually, the young undisputed heavyweight champion would lose his spot at the top in what would become one of the biggest upsets not only in the history of boxing, but in the history of all sporting events. On February 11, 1990, Mike Tyson would lose in a 10th-round knockout to a relatively unknown Buster Douglas, upsetting the potential for a showdown with #1 contender Evander Holyfield, who went on to make short work of Douglas just a few months later. This was also the first broadcast featuring a new blow-by-blow commentator who would go on to become the voice of HBO boxing for the next 28 years, Jim Lampley. The 90s would be another strong decade for the sport and for HBO as pay-per-views became more of a regular occurrence. The decade began with a stacked class of heavyweight fighters like Holyfield, Bowe, Moore, and a middle-aged George Foreman who would eventually regain a piece of the heavyweight championship crown at age 45. But the sport's biggest draw had walked away from HBO. after tentatively agreeing to an unprecedented $85 million deal with HBO, Tyson and his promoter Don King demanded that analyst Larry Merchant no longer provide commentary on his specific fights. Standing by Merchant, HBO executives allowed Tyson and King to walk away into the arms of rival premium cable network Showtime. This would be the first crack in the foundation of HBO Championship boxing and its influence on the sport. Several new fighters emerged as the decade went on, and HBO would remain on top due to its large budget and relationships with fighters and promoters. Additional program was added in an effort to showcase up-and-coming contenders in the sport. Several more future Hall of Famers would step foot into the ring as the new millennium began. Fighters like Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Manny Pacquiao, Bernard Hopkins and Roy Jones Jr. would become household names while fighting regularly on HBO, while the network continued to expand its storytelling both inside and outside of the ring, though it didn't always come without controversy. With few exceptions throughout the majority of 4 consecutive decades, most of the best fights were on HBO, as their slogan stated. Promoters knew that in order to get maximum exposure for their fighters and brand, they had to go to HBO. This was largely the case until February 2013, when boxing superstar Floyd Mayweather, whose 9 HBO pay-per-view events had drawn nearly 10 million buys and more than $543 million in television revenue, left the network for a 6-fight, $200 million-plus deal with Showtime. After 14 years, HBO was unable to come to terms with Mayweather and allowed him to walk away. It was also decided the network would no longer allow any fighter managed by Al Haymon to appear on the network due to what executives refer to as philosophical differences. Haymon not only managed Mayweather, but also a large portion of prominent fighters promoted by Oscar de la Hoya's Golden Boy Promotions. Consequently, this led to HBO also deciding to no longer televise Golden Boy fights, at least temporarily, which it announced just 1 month later. And just like that, in one fell swoop, the sport's biggest draw, one of the 2 biggest promoters, and a huge roster of prominent and up-and-coming fighters were gone, with nowhere else to go than to Showtime Boxing. Although it may have been great for Showtime, it was the beginning of the severed and divided world of boxing we currently know today. This meant that the opportunity for cross-promotional fights would become less and less likely. HBO now had to rely solely on Top Rank and a handful of smaller promoters like K2 and Main Events, and for the first time in its 40-year history, it no longer had complete leverage in the sport of boxing. Over the course of the next 5 years, the boxing world would begin to undergo a major shift as HBO gradually let go of the sport that helped put it on the map. In January 2015, Golden Boy would cut ties with manager Al Haymon, and the door would be open for Golden Boy fighters to fight on HBO once again, but with a diminished stable of fighters compared to 2013. Also in early 2015, Al Haymon would go on to create Premier Boxing Champions, a new promotion consisting of many fighters he had managed, and make an attempt to bring boxing back to network and non-premium cable television. With a major bankroll, PBC quickly compiled a stable of both top and up-and-coming fighters. In May of that year, Golden Boy filed a $300 million lawsuit against Al Haymon for violating the Mohamed Ali Act, which disallows a person to act as both a manager and promoter of a fighter simultaneously. A few months later, promoter Bob Arum of Top Rank filed a similar suit, also alleging that PBC had violated antitrust laws and had attempted to create a monopoly by buying time on ESPN, NBC, NBC Sports Net, CBS, Spike TV, Fox, Fox Sports 1, and Bounce TV, leaving few options for Top Rank and other promoters to televise their fights. Golden Boy's suit was later dismissed, and Top Rank's was settled for an undisclosed amount. By this time, HBO was still occasionally giving fans big fights, but they became fewer and far between, and cards were noticeably less stacked than they once had the luxury of being. In August of 2017, the final blow was landed as Top Rank signed a new 7-year deal with ESPN, leaving HBO for good and stripping the network of even more top talent. With PBC and Top Rank both out of the picture, HBO had clearly run out of leverage in the sport of boxing. Over the next year, HBO would still manage to hold on to a few of the sport's most prominent fighters like Gennady Golovkin, Canelo Alvarez, Sergey Kovalev, and Dmitry Bivol, but there was a lack of deep competition for the remaining big-name fighters to go up against, and the future of HBO boxing began to look very grim. The last pay-per-view would air on September 15, 2018, when Golovkin and Canelo would face off for the second time, and just a few weeks later it was announced that after 45 years of broadcasting, HBO boxing would be coming to an end. The final card aired on December 8th, ending with a tearful and heartfelt final goodbye from commentators Max Kellerman, Roy Jones Jr., and Jim Lampley, with former analyst Larry Merchant making a return for the final farewell. By the time the final bell rang, the world of boxing had changed drastically. Premier Boxing Champions had settled back onto Showtime and on Fox. Top Rank continued to televise all of their fight cards on ESPN and ESPN+, and Golden Boy would go on to sign a deal with the sport's newest player, streaming service DAZN, along with promoter Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing. With the major promotions on separate networks, the sport has been left in a fractured state where the best fighting the best has become even more of a rarity. Though promoters are occasionally willing to come together to cross-promote fights, opposing exclusive network deals muddy the water, often slowing down or stopping negotiations from happening altogether. From a positive standpoint, between all the networks and streaming services, more fight cards are being televised, giving more opportunity for more up-and-coming fighters to get national and global exposure, though many would argue that not all fights are worthy of being televised. Pay-per-view events occur regularly across all the separate networks, even on DAZN, who once vowed to eliminate pay-per-views from the world of boxing. But cards are rarely stacked with blockbuster fights and typically don't constitute the need to be a pay-per-view event. In the end, it would seem HBO itself was the reason for its cancellation of boxing programming, allowing major promoters and fighters to walk away until the talent pool became just too small to stay competitive in the market. So what happened? Why did HBO let go of the sport that helped grow the network into a global powerhouse in television? According to journalist and author James Andrew Miller, who wrote Tinderbox, HBO's ruthless pursuit of new frontiers, the change began long before the company began walking away from its relationships with fighters and promoters. As early as the late 90s, HBO Sports, the umbrella under which boxing operated, began to change when it decided to end coverage of Wimbledon, the most prestigious of tennis events that had been broadcast on the network since 1975. Simultaneously, HBO's original content began to grow exponentially. Shows like The Sopranos, Sex and the City, and The Wire quickly became major successes and paved the way for shows like True Blood, Boardwalk Empire, and Game of Thrones. HBO became less and less about sports and gradually became more and more about its original content that was and is very expensive to produce, but also attracted a much wider audience. As it moved into the new world of streaming, it would seem HBO just no longer needed boxing in order to be successful.